If every country is in debt, who are they borrowing from? If every country is drowning in debt, who are they actually borrowing from? And more importantly, why can't they just stop? This isn't just a poor country problem. Even the richest nations are buried in debt. From India and Germany to Switzerland and Qatar, sovereign debt is practically a universal phenomenon. Even global economic powerhouses aren't exempt. Japan, for instance, has a debt that's more than twice the size of its entire economy, sitting at over 260% of its GDP. Meanwhile, the United States is juggling a jaw-dropping $36 trillion in national debt, and that number keeps rising daily. That sounds insane, right? But this leads us to a much deeper, more important question. Why are countries always in debt? And more curiously, who are they borrowing from? Section 1. What is national debt? Let's begin by understanding what we mean when we talk about national debt. National debt, also called public debt, government debt, or sovereign debt, is the total amount of money a central government owes to its creditors. To put it simply, just like people take loans when they can't afford something up front, like buying a house or paying for college, governments do the same when their expenses exceed their income. But instead of borrowing from a single bank, countries borrow from a mix of lenders, domestic banks, foreign governments, international institutions, and even their own people. And here's a key distinction. When we talk about a country's national debt, we're usually referring only to the central or federal government's debt, not the debt of cities or states. For example, when we say the US has $36 trillion in national debt, that figure reflects only what Washington, D.C. owes, not what states like California or New York might owe individually. Section 2. Why governments borrow money. So why do governments need to borrow in the first place? Can't they just print more money? It seems like an easy fix, but history proves otherwise. Let's break it down. 1. Budget deficits. Governments collect revenue primarily through taxes, like income tax, sales tax, and corporate tax. But often that's not enough to cover their spending. Let's say the US collects $4 trillion in taxes, but needs $6 trillion to fund healthcare, defense, infrastructure, and social programs. That leaves a $2 trillion shortfall. Instead of raising taxes, which could make voters angry, or cutting programs, which might be politically damaging, governments usually choose to borrow. Real-world example. In 2023, Canada had a federal budget deficit of over $35 billion, primarily due to pandemic spending and increased healthcare costs. Rather than drastically hiking taxes or cutting essential services, the government issued new debt to fill the gap. 2. Economic growth investments. Borrowing isn't always a sign of trouble, it's also a way to invest in the future. Just like people take loans to start businesses or pay for college, countries borrow to build roads, schools, hospitals, and broadband internet. These investments create jobs, boost economic activity, and generate higher tax revenues down the line. Real-world example. South Korea heavily borrowed during the 1960s and 70s to build up its manufacturing and infrastructure. That strategic borrowing helped transform it into a global tech and industrial giant today. 3. Crisis management. Emergencies like wars, pandemics, or natural disasters can suddenly increase expenses and reduce revenue. Real-world example. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the US borrowed nearly $3.8 trillion in 2020 alone. That money funded stimulus checks, unemployment aid, vaccines, and business relief. If the US hadn't borrowed, the economic collapse would have been far worse, and unemployment might have reached Great Depression levels. 4. Debt refinancing. Rolling over. Sometimes countries borrow not for new spending but to pay off old debt. Governments often borrow to pay off old debt, a practice known as rolling over debt. It's like paying one credit card with another. Suppose a country borrowed money in 2010 and the loan is due in 2020. Instead of paying it all off at once, they might issue new bonds in 2020, raise fresh money, and use it to repay the 2010 debt. If done responsibly, this cycle can continue without harm. But if the borrowing grows too large and outpaces the country's economic output, it can trigger a debt crisis. That's what happened in Sri Lanka in 2022 when unsustainable borrowing led to bankruptcy, food shortages, and mass protests. Real-world example. Italy regularly issues new government bonds to repay older ones that are maturing. As long as investors trust the government will repay eventually, this cycle continues smoothly. 5. Economic stabilization. Governments and central banks use debt to influence inflation and interest rates. For example, if inflation is high, the government may issue more bonds to absorb excess money. If the economy is sluggish, they may borrow and spend more to stimulate growth. Real-world example. In 2009, during the Great Recession, the US implemented a $787 billion stimulus package, largely funded by borrowing to revive the economy. Section 3. Who lends to governments? So, we understand why governments borrow. Now, let's answer the big question. Who's actually lending them all this money? Governments often take on billions or even trillions in debt. But where does that money come from? It's not just sitting in one big bank vault. In fact, countries borrow from many different places. There are some major sources. 1. Domestic investors. These include local individuals, banks, pension funds, mutual funds, and insurance companies. You might not know this, but you can actually lend money to your own government. This is done by buying bonds, like US Treasury bonds. When you buy one, you're basically loaning the government money, and they'll pay you back with interest. Not just individuals, but local banks like Bank of America, investment funds, even some companies do this too. And it's not just private investors. Government agencies also buy bonds using their extra funds. This is called intragovernmental debt. For example, the US Social Security Administration buys bonds to earn interest and grow the money it uses to pay out benefits. As of March 2025, around $7.3 trillion, that's 20% of US national debt, is owed to these types of agencies. Canadian citizens can also buy Canada Savings Bonds, which function in a similar way. 2. Foreign governments and investors. Just like locals, people and banks from other countries can also buy US Treasury bonds. Countries like China, Japan, and the UK hold hundreds of billions in US debt. Why? Because US government bonds are seen as the safest place on earth to park money, even safer than their own banks. But when a country's economy is weak, foreign investors don't trust them to pay back. So instead of buying bonds, they prefer direct loans where they can set conditions or guarantees. Real-world example. China owns over $800 billion in US Treasury securities. It helps keep the Chinese yuan stable and gives China leverage in global trade diplomacy. 3. International institutions, World Bank, ADB. When developing countries can't attract private investors, they turn to institutions like the World Bank or Africa Development Bank, ADB. These institutions offer loans for development projects, such as building roads, schools, or dams. Real-world example, in 2023, Bangladesh received a $2.25 billion loan from the World Bank to improve education, transport, and renewable energy infrastructure. 4. The International Monetary Fund. Unlike the World Bank, the IMF steps in when countries are in deep financial trouble, currency crashes, runaway inflation, or balance of payment problems. But IMF loans often come with strict conditions. Countries must cut spending, increase taxes, privatize public assets, or remove subsidies. Real-world example. Greece borrowed €320 billion from the IMF and EU during its debt crisis. In return, it had to implement painful austerity measures, which triggered mass protests and unemployment spikes. 5. Central banks. Lastly, countries can borrow from their own central banks. But this is tricky. When central banks fund government debt by printing money, it risks inflation and currency devaluation. Real-world example, in Zimbabwe in the 2000s, the government printed money to pay off debts, leading to hyperinflation where a loaf of bread cost billions of Zimbabwean dollars. I make a video explaining in depth about that. Link in the description. Today, most developed nations, like the US or Canada, avoid this route unless there's a true emergency. Section 4. Is national debt a bad thing? The answer is, not always. Debt can actually be useful if it's managed properly. As we said earlier, borrowing to build roads, schools, or hospitals can help the economy grow, and during tough times, like the COVID-19 pandemic, borrowing helped keep businesses running and saved jobs. But of course, too much debt is risky. If a country borrows just to pay off older debt, it falls into a debt trap. At some point, it might end up spending more on interest than on healthcare or education. Worse, if lenders think a country might not be able to pay them back, they lose confidence. This can lead to a credit rating downgrade, kind of like how your credit score drops if you miss payments. With a bad credit rating, it's harder and more expensive for a country to borrow more money. This can spiral into a debt crisis and even lead to default, where the country officially admits it can't pay back what it owes. This happened in Sri Lanka in 2022. And no, when a country defaults, it doesn't go bankrupt the same way a business would. If you want a full video on what happens when a country defaults, let me know in the comments. So how do we know when debt is too much? There's no exact number, but a common way to check is the debt-to-GDP ratio, basically comparing a country's total debt to the size of its economy. For example, if a country has a GDP of $100 billion and its debt is $60 billion, then its debt-to-GDP ratio is 60%. Many experts say 60% or lower is manageable, but it really depends on the country. Some countries, like the US, have a debt ceiling, a legal cap on how much debt the government can take on. But honestly, it doesn't do much. The US just raises the ceiling every time to avoid default. Section 5. Can a country be debt-free? Technically yes, but in real life it almost never happens, and for most economies being debt-free isn't even a smart goal. Is there any place with no debt? Not really. Every country carries some level of debt. The closest example might be Macau, but Macau isn't a full country, it's a region of China. It's small, with fewer than 1 million people, and it earns a ton of money from casinos, even more than Las Vegas. But clearly, not every country can turn itself into a casino hub. Even if a country could pay off all its debt, most won't. That's because getting rid of all debt would mean either cutting spending massively or raising taxes a lot, both of which could hurt the economy and trigger protests. Also, without government debt, there would be no bonds, and bonds are important. Pension funds depend on them because they are a safe, low-risk investment. Without them, retirement funds would have to invest in riskier things, making the system less stable. So in the end, debt is a double-edged sword. Used the right way, it helps a country grow. Closing thoughts. In summary, countries borrow money for budget deficits, future investments, crises, refinancing, and economic stabilization. Their lenders include domestic investors, foreign governments, international financial institutions, and even central banks. Debt isn't inherently bad. When managed well, it can be a powerful tool to build roads, educate citizens, create jobs, and save economies. But misused or misunderstood, it can spark disaster. So the next time you hear about trillions in borrowing, remember it's not always recklessness. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's survival, and sometimes it's hope. But if countries like the US are buried in debt, and still borrowing more every year, how come no one's pressing the panic button? The answer might shock you. Subscribe, because in our next video, we'll uncover why the US can never pay off its debt and why that might be exactly the plan.